Ruth Ann gives some good advice. If there's one thing you can do to stay out of trouble is know the law and be able to quote the law. We have laws all over the place, and we have hierarchies of laws that we don't think about. We have a hierarchy at law at my house, too. I have 3 daughters, Emily, Eleanor, and Becca, who's 8 years old. Becca is kind of like the Supreme Court justice, and we're kind of lower court justices at our house in a lot of ways, and she kind of calls the shots. But you know, we find in history, even in big empires, they needed to have some sort of hierarchy to say who makes the final decision. And the Emperor Justinian codified a lot of the laws in Roman law, and we in the West kind of inherited a lot of those traditions from that time. A hierarchy of law. We have hierarchy of laws. We have 2 areas of government that we break down laws here in this country. We've got 2 flags there, United States and the state of Utah. Though the states were the ones that created the federal government's laws ultimately trump state laws in the hierarchy of law. And now we are, as the state of Utah, we were actually created by federal law, but the original 13 colonies created the federal government, and the states under the hierarchy of law become subordinate. Their laws become subordinate to the state law. What that means is if there's a federal law that is different from the state law, just like if Becca, my 8-year-old, has a disagreement with Dad, at some point a decision has to be made. And in this particular case, in the hierarchy of law, the federal government trumps state law. Now when our country was founded, they established a constitution which became the supreme law of the land, which set the parameters by which other laws would be established in our country. And that's a very interesting and very important document to get to know. And you might think that the United States Constitution at the local level of even property tax may not have all that much relevance, but in fact it actually does. There are due process provisions within the United States Constitution, which means that before life, liberty, and property can be taken by the government, they have to go through a due process. Those due process clauses are very important in this country and permeate down through federal law, federal statute, state constitution, etc. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution is a very important amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to it are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. And what that means is that the states have a lot of autonomy in terms of how they tax their citizens. And so you see a great amount of deviation between states and locals. And that's why in Colorado they do things a little bit differently than they do in Utah. Because the 10th Amendment gives the states a lot of autonomy in how they tax their citizens. Some states, for example, tourist states, for example, they rely very heavily upon the sales tax. Some states don't even have a property tax, and some states don't have an income tax. It really depends, and this is all because of the 10th Amendment. The Constitution allows this amount of latitude by the states. United States Code, right below the United States Constitution. If you ever really have a problem getting to sleep sometime, I encourage you to go to certain websites where you can go read federal code. It's very long, very tedious, but nevertheless there are important things in there that actually impact us here at the state. And sometimes decisions come that affect us at the state based upon interpretations of federal laws. For example, the 4R Act. of 1976 prohibited the imposition of ad valorem property taxes on transportation property, higher rate than the tax rate generally applicable to commercial and industrial property in the same assessment jurisdiction. And basically what that means is that what they found out in the 60s and 70s is that a lot of local jurisdictions were assessing property differently if they were big interstate transportation companies. And because they didn't vote locally, they were being taxed as if they didn't actually have a vote. And so they actually get a break under, all state laws. And we can probably teach a whole class on that, but that's just an example of how a federal law can actually impact property tax regulation. Driver's Privacy Protection Act. This relates to motor vehicle information. There was a time where motor vehicle information was public information because it was actually part of the tax base. We assessed a property tax on your vehicle. And so Jill, we just walked in on us. See, I got through the traffic jam. Yeah. Well, Jill, let's say Jill had a vehicle, and back in the old days, and it was assessed a property tax. If I wanted to know where Jill lived, I could go to the assessor's office and find out all the information, what car she drove, and where she lived, and a lot of other pertinent information. Driver's Privacy Protection Act came into existence to protect that information because, say Jill has an ex who wanted to find her and she didn't want to be found, they were able to use that information. So this is another example of where federal statute can, in fact, influence what we do at the state level. State constitution is at the state level. That's our highest governing law. And this was established in 1896. And Ruth Ann mentioned that even in the Utah Territory, property tax was existence. And in fact, the whole infrastructure existed to assess the value of property at that time. And because of the fact that there was already this local infrastructure of services being provided by local government, the state constitution codified into their constitution a lot of provisions of what was going on with Utah Territory. Article 13 of the Utah State Constitution is where property tax is really governed. And and if you ever want to be able to answer to a citizen, who calls in, say, on what basis are you doing this? Or they say that my tax is unconstitutional, you can't tax my house. You can go right to Article 13 of the Utah State Constitution where it says, so that each person and corporation pays a tax in proportion to the fair market value of his, her, or its tangible property. All tangible property in the state that is not exempt under the laws of the United States or under this Constitution shall be importantly assessed at a uniform and equal rate in proportion to its fair market value to be ascertained as provided by law. And it's supposed to be taxed at a uniform and equal rate. So this is right here in the Utah State Constitution. The Constitution also is where if property is exempted from taxation, it has to go through the Utah State Constitution. And so if you want a list of all the exemptions, with the exception of one, can anyone tell me which exemption is not in the Utah State Constitution? No. It's the blind. The blind exemption is not in the Utah State Constitution. It was passed by statute, and probably if someone was to challenge that, the justices would probably have to rule that unconstitutional, but no one has had the heart to go after the blind. So, and there's a lesson to that, and that is basically statute becomes law unless it is challenged by a constitutional challenge. But nevertheless, the blind exemption is not in the Utah Constitution. all the other exemptions are. And to amend the Constitution, it's not as easy as just talking to your legislator and passing a law. Because it requires a joint resolution. It has to have 2/3 vote in both houses. So you got to have pretty good consensus among legislators to make that happen. It does not require governor's signatures, so you don't need to talk to the governor about it. But you do have to get a majority vote by the voters in the next general election. And Maryland, do we get amendments to the Constitution on the ballot? You've been doing county clerk for about half of my voting life in Tooele, a long time. You know, what's an example of what was on the ballot this last election cycle that? I ask you a hard one, yeah.
Honestly, I can't remember something about taxes.
Yeah.
Most of them are about taxes,
Yeah.
or every now and then changing the Constitution. But
There was one about the Tax Commission, actually, and it was about the makeup of the Tax Commission, where it had previously been, and well, it currently has to be can't have more than 2 members of one particular political party. There was a constitutional amendment proposed that would get rid of that provision and make it based upon qualifications. That actually failed. It was important for the citizens, evidently, to keep some political balance in the makeup of the Tax Commission. So nevertheless, there are provisions that do take place at the you amend the Constitution, and those do happen from time to time. This is a look at my cubicle. This is embarrassing, you know. Shows you, first of all, that I used to have dark hair when I came to the Tax Commission, and it shows you that we collect these Utah Code books all the time. And if you don't have a Utah Code book, I highly recommend one. Ruth Ann is waving this. Ruth Ann is a little different than I am. She's smarter. She's smarter and better looking, but besides that, every year she gets that code book and she goes and put tabs and marks up her code book religiously. I can't do that. I mean, I'm not disciplined enough to go and do that every single year, you know. But so I have a list. I have a Word file of important statutory references that I go to, and then if something comes up, then I'll add to that Word file and I'll look through that and I'll access it on the Utah Legislative website. The Utah Legislature, I don't always agree with them, but I tell you, they have an awesome website where you can access the Utah State Constitution and Utah Code. So knowing the Utah Code is very important to property tax. And here's some very important property tax titles. The most important, the one that we live by. And if you ever have any question on Utah Code, ask Ruth Ann. She's been doing this for a while. 59-2, the Property Tax Act. Title 59 is Revenue and Taxation. And 59-2 is a long statute, but that's where we're governed by below the constitutional level. Some other important statutes to know are Title 17, which relates to counties. 17B, local districts. 17C, if you really want to get confused and really lose faith in humanity, you can read all about Community Development and Renewal Agency Acts, or RDAs, as people refer to them. 17D has to do with special districts. 41-1A is Motor Vehicle Act, and 63G-2. This is an important one, believe it or not. For all of your records that you keep at the county level are governed under Title 63G-2 of the Government Records Access and Management Act. And much property tax information is governed by that. Others, 53A-2 has to do with school districts and their funding. 63G, it's the Utah Administrative Rulemaking Act, which allows an agency to adopt rules to implement statutes and provide interpretive guidance on legislative intent. There's public hearings for new rules or any change to a rule. Anytime a rule is going to be amended, there's a public hearing, and those are advertised on the state's tax commission website. And we go through one that's important to us property tax folks every year as it relates to personal property schedules, or administrative rule, we call it the 33. There's administrative rules by the tax commission are very important areas where if something needs some clarification or you know, additional elaboration from statute, administrative rule goes in to provide that guidance. For example, 884-24P-19 has appraiser designation program. For those of you who are assessors and or in the assessor staff and need to go through certain classes and you know, and training in order to become designated, that's governed there. Personal property schedules, I mentioned before, that's an important hearing that we have every year, where the personal property valuation guides become approved. 36, contents of real property tax notice. Your notices that are sent out have to follow certain guidelines as established in the administrative rule. And for example, there's also valuation of state assessed unitary properties. Josh's old job was in a centrally assessed area of property tax. They were governed very much by that area. Opinions. How much weight in the hierarchy of law is Dave's opinion? It's pretty far down. However, if I was to write something working for the tax commission and my official title, they gave an interpretation of a position that would actually carry some weight. That's why I'm very careful what I write. That's why we have to be very careful, because it can, if there's nothing else out there, that can actually carry some weight. The tax commission writes advisory opinions, where people will actually ask the tax commission, what do you think about this? Can we get some guidance? They will write those. The Attorney General's office can write opinions. Property tax standards of practice, we have those that handle property tax at a procedural level. And Josh is going to show you a little bit more of those later. Those are important resources for you, I hope you get to know. And we're always updating those. DMV Procedures Manual. Again, anything that's procedural, that's documented, those are important. Internal audit findings and internal manuals and instruction materials. I would encourage you at the county to have written procedures wherever possible, because those actually carry weight when someone challenges you. If you know the procedure cannot deviate from the hierarchy of law. If there's a statute, it cannot be different from a statute or a rule. But if it clarifies county practice in some way, to make sure that one taxpayer in your county is treated the same as everybody else, any kind of written procedures you have is very, very important to have. And just wanted to give you a plug on that. I'll give you a pitch for the standards of practice as well. We work on these. When I first came to the property tax division, God, 1991, I came to the standards unit in 1993, and it was a long time ago. You wouldn't recognize me, but we were working on the standards of practice at that time, and I wrote a good chunk of the personal property standard. And those are very helpful for answering questions. And if you guys ever have something that you feel needs some clarification, it's perfectly legitimate for you to ask us to add that into the standards of practice. We may or may not, but if we think it, you know, if we come to a conclusion that would be helpful in providing clarity to the practices that we have, I think it's an area that we can certainly provide some help.
May I just add something?
No, you may not, Ruth. No.
If it's a procedural kind of issue, we can add it without the permission from the commission. But if it's a policy issue, we have to run that standard through the state tax commission in order to put it in the standard of practice.
That's right.
So there's a difference between procedural kinds of things and policy kinds of things. We handle them differently in terms of standards of practice.
But we have to be careful because sometimes what we consider procedural, the commission considers policy. And sometimes they say, well, we would consider that policy, and they'll come back and say, well, that's just a procedural issue, you handle it. You know, so sometimes it's not clear cut, but we do our best to try to make sure that these standards of practice get some oversight, but we hope that they're a resource that you guys can use. Here's some examples of them. Board of Equalization. One of the fun jobs that you get to have as a governing body of your county is you either do it yourself as a Board of Equalization or you oversee that process. Certified tax rates, one that for some of us this time of year is a real governing standard for us. Property tax distribution, manufactured mobile home housing. Thank goodness it's there, even though most counties don't have a large number of them. But I tell you what, things like manufactured houses may not be a lot of the tax base, but they can be a big part of your everyday headaches sometimes in your county if you have a lot of them. And here's some links and resources. U.S. Constitution. I think it's always good to understand the U.S. Constitution and all the amendments and how they fit together. United States Code. And again, I'm going to mention that legislative website. I'm going to make a plug for it. One of the things I love about that is I can cut and paste information from that website and put it into a document, whether it's an email, whether it's a letter or something. Very, very good for referencing because as Ruth Ann said, and I don't want to disagree with Ruth Ann because I'm scared of her a little bit, but it's very important to follow the law and to know the law. And whenever you can quote statute or rule or some sort of authority, you really cover yourself. It's when you deviate from that. When you deviate from that, you really take a lot of risk in your profession, you know, working in the property tax area. And because again, I can express my opinions, but my opinion only carries weight if it hasn't already been decided at the statute level. So anyway, any questions from you all about hierarchy of law?